The Montana wind carried dust and desperation across the empty prairie as Greta Winslow fell to her knees beside her husband's grave. The wooden cross bore only his name and dates. No room for dreams that died with him. Her mother's worn Bible clutched against her chest. She lifted her tear-streaked face to the endless sky. God, if you can hear me through all this shame. Her voice broke like autumn leaves. I have nothing left. They call me barren. They whisper that you cursed me. Maybe they're right. The words tasted bitter, but she had to say them. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of praying for a child. 3 years of watching hope crumble like the dried flowers on Nathaniel's grave. 40 miles away, Deacon Marshall stood on his ranch porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. Something stirred in his chest, an ache he couldn't name, a pull he couldn't explain. For 2 years, he'd lived alone in this cabin that once held laughter. 2 years since fever took his wife Sarah and their boy Tommy. 2 years of asking God why he'd given him love only to steal it away. But today felt different. Today, that familiar voice whispered in the silence of his heart, "Go to town. Find a widow. Help her." Deacon shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He was nobody's answer to prayer. He was just a broken man with calloused hands and a heart full of questions. Back in Harbor Peak, the boarding house buzzed with the kind of gossip that small towns feast on. Celine Murphy wiped down tables while her customers picked apart Greta's life like vultures. 3 years married and not even a miscarriage to show for it, clucked Mrs. Henderson, her voice dripping false sympathy. Poor Nathaniel, God rest his soul, tied to a barren woman. Tobias Crane, the banker's nephew, leaned back in his chair with a cruel smile. I'll bet $50 that Widow Winslow will be begging on the streets within 6 months. No man wants damaged goods, and she sure can't run Nathaniel's farm alone. The women tittered, but Celine felt something twist in her stomach. She'd seen Greta in church, had watched the young woman's faith shine even through her grief. There was something pure about Greta that made Celine remember her own lost innocence. Maybe someone will surprise you, Tobias, she said quietly, setting down his coffee harder than necessary. Maybe God has plans none of us can see. Tobias laughed. God? If God cared about that woman, he'd have given her a baby. Mark my words, she'll be gone by Christmas, one way or another. Meanwhile, Greta picked herself up from the dust and walked back to the empty farmhouse. Each room echoed with memories of a love that had been real, even if it hadn't been fruitful. Nathaniel had never made her feel broken. He'd held her through disappointment after disappointment, whispering that God's timing wasn't their timing. But Nathaniel was gone, and God felt further away than the mountains on the horizon. She sat at their kitchen table, her table now, and opened the Bible to Psalms, searching for comfort she wasn't sure existed anymore. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," she read aloud, "and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The words felt hollow, like promises made to someone else. How could she be sure God even saw her anymore? That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the prairie, Deacon saddled his horse despite every practical reason to stay home. The voice in his heart had grown stronger throughout the day, impossible to ignore. He'd learned not to question these moments. They'd save his life more than once during his ranger days. But this felt different. This felt like hope, and hope was dangerous for a man who'd buried his world. As he rode toward town, memories surfaced unbidden. Sarah's laugh when she told him about the baby. Tommy's first steps across this same prairie grass. The fever that took them both in a week, leaving him with questions that had no answers and prayers that felt like throwing stones at the sky. He'd stopped believing God had plans that made sense. But tonight, something ancient and persistent stirred in his chest. The same feeling he'd had the night before he met Sarah. The same certainty that had led him to propose after knowing her only 3 months. Back in Harbor Peak, Greta lit her last candle and opened the letter that had arrived that afternoon. The bank notice was polite but firm. mortgage payment due in 30 days, or face foreclosure. She had no money, no prospects, no family to turn to. The town had made their judgment clear. She was a burden, a reminder of God's mysterious cruelty, a woman whose very presence made others uncomfortable. She knelt beside her bed as she had every night of her adult life. But tonight the words came harder. I don't understand your ways, Lord. I don't understand why you gave me such love for children, but no children to love. I don't understand why you took Nathaniel when we were just beginning. The people here think you've cursed me, and maybe they're right. Tears fell freely now, each one carrying pieces of her faith. But if you're still listening, if you still care about one broken woman in the middle of nowhere, I need help. I need someone to see me as more than my failures. I need to matter to someone again. At that exact moment, Deacon reined in his horse at the edge of town, staring at the distant lights of Harbor Peak. His chest ached with certainty he couldn't explain, purpose he couldn't deny. Tomorrow, he would do something that made no sense to his practical mind, but perfect sense to whatever remained of his believing heart. Tomorrow, he would answer a prayer he'd never heard but somehow understood. Neither Greta nor Deacon slept that night, both sensing that morning would bring change as sure as sunrise. In the mysterious ways that God moves across broken hearts and dusty prayers, their stories were about to become one story, a story of redemption that would start with the simplest words. Ma'am, I believe God sent me to help you. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over Harbor Peak when Marshall Thompson pulled his wagon up to Greta's door. The town's only preacher-turned-messenger had drawn the short straw, and his weathered face showed the discomfort of his mission. Mrs. Winslow, he called softly, not wanting to startle her. There's a man outside town who, well, he's made an unusual offer. Greta emerged from the farmhouse, her black morning dress dusty from another sleepless night of packing. She'd already decided to leave Harbor Peak. The bank notice had made that choice for her. What kind of offer? She asked, though her heart had been praying for any kind of miracle since yesterday's desperate plea. Marshall shifted uncomfortably on his wagon seat. Deacon Hayes. He's got a ranch about 40 miles north. He's looking for someone to help with his place. Room and board, respectable arrangement. He paused, studying her face. But I got to warn you, ma'am. Deacon's not like other folks. He's been alone too long, and he's got reasons for staying that way. The ride to Deacon's ranch stretched across rolling hills that gradually turned wild and untamed. Marshall's warnings echoed in Greta's mind with every mile. He lost his family to fever 2 years back, the older man had explained as they bounced along the rutted path. His wife Sarah was sweet as summer honey, and their boy Tommy was the light of his life. When they died, something in Deacon died too. He stopped coming to town, stopped talking to neighbors, stopped talking to God, far as I can tell. Greta listened while silently praying. Every bump in the road felt like a test of faith, every mile a step toward either salvation or deeper isolation. Lord, she whispered as prairie wind whipped her hair, if this is your answer to my prayer, help me be worthy of it. Help me see what you want me to see in this man. The ranch appeared suddenly over a rise, a simple log cabin surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that had seen better days. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a few cattle grazed in the distance. But the whole place felt hollow, like a house where laughter had died. Marshall pulled up to the porch just as the door opened. Deacon Hayes stepped out, and Greta's breath caught. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. But it wasn't his appearance that struck her. It was the pain he carried like a heavy coat, the same kind of grief she recognized in her own mirror. Here was a man who'd argued with God and lost. Ma'am, Deacon said simply, touching his hat brim. His voice was rough from disuse, careful with each word. I'm grateful you came. I know this arrangement is unusual. Marshall climbed down and began unloading Greta's few belongings. Deacon, you sure about this? Mrs. Winslow here is a good Christian woman. She deserves better than. I'll treat her with respect. Deacon cut him off, his jaw tightening. She needs a place to stay. I need help with the ranch. It's practical, nothing more. But as Greta stepped down from the wagon, their eyes met for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Two souls who'd both cried out to heaven and weren't sure anyone was listening anymore. Deacon showed her to the small room that had once been his son's. The walls were bare except for a child's drawing still tacked above the bed. A stick-figure family under a yellow sun. Tommy drew that, Deacon said quietly, then immediately looked like he regretted speaking. You can take it down if you want. It's beautiful, Greta said softly. He had his father's eyes, didn't he? Deacon's composure cracked just slightly. How did you? He caught himself, rebuilt the wall around his heart. Supper's at 6. I'll show you the chores tomorrow. That evening, they sat at opposite ends of a table built for 4, eating beans and cornbread in silence. But when Greta quietly said grace, "Thank you, Lord, for this food and for shelter," she saw Deacon's hands pause over his plate. His head didn't bow, but he didn't interrupt either. After supper, while Deacon tended the horses, Greta explored the cabin. In the main room, she found a family Bible covered in dust, still open to Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read aloud. "I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." The pages were worn, especially around the verses about comfort and restoration. This had been someone's anchor once. When Deacon returned, he found her holding the Bible. "That was Sarah's," he said, his voice tight. "She read from it every night, said it was God's way of talking to us." He laughed bitterly. Guess God didn't have much to say when the fever came. Greta set the Bible down carefully. Maybe he was saying something we couldn't hear yet. And maybe, Deacon said, turning away, some prayers just don't get answered. Later, lying in Tommy's old bed, Greta stared at the child's drawing and felt something stir in her heart. Not hope exactly, but possibility. This broken man had somehow known to help her yesterday, had felt called to offer shelter to a stranger. That wasn't coincidence. That was God working through wounded hearts to heal wounded hearts. Down the hall, Deacon sat on his bed, holding a photograph of Sarah and Tommy. For 2 years, he'd talked to that picture every night, telling them about his day, asking them what he should do. Tonight felt different. Tonight, he found himself saying, "I brought someone here, a woman who's lost as much as me. I don't know why I did it, but maybe you'd approve." The wind outside sounded almost like an answer. Not words, but something warmer than silence. And for the first time in years, Deacon wondered if maybe, just maybe, God hadn't abandoned this ranch after all. As dawn approached, both Greta and Deacon lay awake, sensing that morning would bring their first real test. Would she prove herself capable of ranch life? Or would this strange arrangement crumble before it even began? Neither knew that they were both praying the same prayer. Help me be what this person needs me to be. Dawn painted the Montana sky gold and pink as Greta stepped onto the ranch porch, her heart hammering with nervous determination. Deacon was already by the corrals, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. She'd prayed half the night for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to prove she belonged here. What she hadn't expected was how natural it felt to walk toward him, coffee cup in hand. "Thought you might need this," she said simply, offering the steaming mug. Deacon looked surprised, not by the coffee, but by the gesture itself. "Thank you," he said, and something in his voice was softer than yesterday. "You ready for this? Ranch work isn't like town living." "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," Greta replied, rolling up her sleeves. "My father always said good intentions and strong hands could overcome most obstacles." The first test came with the ornery milk cow, Bessie, who'd been giving Deacon trouble for weeks. The beast had kicked over 3 buckets and sent 2 ranch hands running. But when Greta approached, something magical happened. She spoke softly, her hands gentle but confident, and Bessie settled like she'd been waiting for the right person all along. The milk flowed smooth and creamy, filling the bucket to the brim. "I'll be damned," Deacon muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, ma'am. It's just, Bessie hasn't cooperated like that since." He stopped, but Greta understood. Since Sarah died, the miracles continued throughout the morning. The stubborn gate that always stuck for Deacon opened easily at Greta's touch. The chickens, usually scattered and difficult to manage, seemed to organize themselves around her presence. Even a ranch dog, Rex, who'd been listless and unfriendly since losing his family, began following her with renewed purpose. But it was the garden that made Deacon truly pay attention. Behind the cabin lay a plot of earth that had been Sarah's pride. Now nothing but weeds and hard-packed dirt. Greta knelt there during her lunch break, her fingers working the soil like she was praying with her hands. "That ground's been dead for 2 years," Deacon said, walking up behind her. "Nothing good's gonna grow there." Greta looked up, dirt smudged on her cheek, eyes bright with purpose. Sometimes the most barren ground just needs someone to believe in it again. She held up a handful of wildflower seeds she'd found in the cabin. "Your wife saved these." Maybe she knew someone would plant them someday. That afternoon, as if summoned by some unseen force, a rider appeared on the horizon. Nakoa Crow Feather approached slowly, his weathered face creased in a knowing smile. The Blackfoot elder had been Deacon's friend for years, trading wisdom for coffee and companionship. "I brought supplies," Nakoa announced, though Deacon hadn't asked for any. "And I wanted to meet the woman who's got the animals talking again." Greta emerged from the chicken coop, eggs cradled in her apron, and Nakoa's smile deepened. "You're the one," he said simply, as if he'd been expecting her for years. "The one who brings life back to dead places." "I'm just helping with chores," Greta said modestly, but Nakoa shook his head. "My grandmother used to say some people carry spring in their hearts. They walk into winter places and things start growing again." He looked meaningfully at Deacon. "Your friend here has been winter for too long." That evening, as they worked together preparing supper, something shifted between them. Greta hummed softly while she cooked, the first music the cabin had heard in years. Deacon found himself listening, his hands moving more smoothly as he repaired tack nearby. When she asked about Sarah's favorite meal, he actually smiled while describing her attempts at apple pie. "She burned the first 3, he said, laughing at the memory. "But she kept trying until she got it right. Said anything worth having was worth ruining a few times first." "She sounds like she was wonderful," Greta said gently. "She was," Deacon replied, "and she would have liked you. You both have that same, I don't know what to call it, that way of making broken things feel whole again." Later, as twilight settled over the ranch, they walked together to check on the horses. The air smelled of rain and possibility, and everywhere they looked, small signs of renewal were appearing. Rex trotted alongside them instead of hiding. The horses whinnied in greeting instead of turning away. Even the wildflowers Greta had planted seemed to have grown an impossible amount in just one day. "This place feels different," Deacon said quietly, almost to himself. "Alive again." Greta stopped walking and turned to face him. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to notice it was still beautiful underneath all that hurt. They stood there in the gathering darkness, two broken people discovering they might fit together in ways that made them both stronger. But before either could find words for what they were feeling, thunder rumbled in the distance. "Storm's coming," Deacon said, scanning the horizon. Dark clouds were building like an angry wall, moving fast across the prairie. "Looks like a bad one." Inside the cabin, they prepared for the weather, closing shutters, securing loose items, battening down for what promised to be a fierce night. But as they worked side by side, Greta noticed Deacon glancing at her with something that looked like concern. "You don't have to worry about me," she said, catching his look. "I'm not afraid of storms." "It's not the storm I'm worried about," Deacon admitted. "It's what storms have a way of revealing. Things that were broken before, things that won't hold under pressure." Outside, the wind began to howl, and the first fat raindrops spattered against the windows. Greta touched Deacon's arm gently. Then maybe it's time to find out what's strong enough to last. As the storm gathered strength, both of them wondered if this fragile partnership they'd built in just 2 days could weather whatever the night might bring. Their small miracles had felt like gifts from heaven, but now those gifts would be tested by wind and rain and whatever else the darkness held. The storm hit with the fury of 10 demons, turning the Montana night into a symphony of wind and water. Rain lashed against the cabin windows, while thunder shook the very foundations. Inside, Greta and Deacon sat by the fire, the warmth flickering between them like the first sparks of something neither dared name yet. In Missouri, we called storms like this widow makers, Greta said, watching lightning illuminate the prairie in stark, silver snapshots. They tear apart anything that isn't rooted deep enough. Deacon nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Sarah used to say storms were God's way of washing the world clean for whatever came next. He paused, seeming surprised he'd shared the memory. I stopped believing that when the fever storm took them. Before Greta could respond, a desperate pounding echoed through the thunder. Someone at their door, fighting against the wind. Deacon grabbed his rifle and pulled open the heavy wooden door to reveal a figure barely standing against the storm's fury. A woman collapsed into their cabin, soaked to the bone and shaking with more than cold. In her arms, she clutched a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and quick. The woman's dark hair was plastered to her head, and her eyes held the wild desperation of a mother watching death circle her child. "Please," she gasped, falling to her knees on their floor. "My boy, he's burning up. The fever won't break. I've been riding for 2 days, looking for help." Her voice cracked like brittle wood. "I saw your light through the storm. God help me, I saw your light." Greta was already moving, her instincts taking over. She knelt beside the woman and gently touched the boy's forehead. His skin burned like a coal from a fire. "What's your name, honey?" she asked the woman softly. "Sarah," came the whispered reply, and both Greta and Deacon froze. "Sarah Mitchell. And this is my boy, Levi." Deacon's face went pale as moon dust. Another Sarah, another dying child. For a moment, he stood paralyzed by the cruel echo of his own tragedy. But then he saw Greta's steady hands already stripping the boy of his wet clothes, her voice calm and sure as she gave instructions. "Give me clean blankets and towels," she told Deacon, "and put water on a boil. We need to bring this fever down slowly." To Sarah, she said, "When did this start?" 3 days ago," Sarah sobbed. "We were traveling west, looking for my brother in Oregon. Levi got caught in the rain, and then the shaking started, and then the fever. I've been praying so hard, begging God not to take my baby. He's all I have left." For the next 6 hours, Greta and Deacon worked as if their own souls depended on it. They bathed Levi in cool water, forcing small sips of willow bark tea down his throat, taking turns holding him when the fever made him delirious. Sarah collapsed from exhaustion, and they cared for her too, wrapping her in blankets and feeding her warm broth. Deacon found himself praying for the first time in 2 years. Not the angry, demanding prayers of his grief, but the desperate, humble pleas of a man who'd remembered what it meant to fight for life instead of surrendering to death. "Please," he whispered as he held Levi during the worst of the boy's shaking. "I know I stopped listening, stopped believing, but this woman rode through hell to find help. If you brought her to our door, then help us be worthy of that trust." Greta worked with the focus of someone who'd found her calling. Every skill she'd learned nursing Nathaniel, every instinct she'd developed caring for animals, every prayer she'd ever whispered over broken things, all of it came together in this moment. She was an instrument in God's hands, and she knew it. Just before dawn, Levi's fever broke. His breathing deepened, his color returned, and he opened clear, bright eyes for the first time in days. "Mama," he whispered, and Sarah burst into tears of relief. But even as they celebrated Levi's recovery, they could see that Sarah was failing. The exhaustion and exposure had taken their toll on her already weak constitution. She was burning with her own fever now, one that wouldn't respond to their treatments. "I knew," Sarah whispered to Greta as the morning sun streamed through the cabin windows. "I knew when I saw your light that God had led me to the right place. Not just for Levi, but for me too." Her voice was growing weaker. "I've been sick for months. The consumption. I was trying to get Levi to my brother before I couldn't take care of him anymore." Greta held Sarah's hand as understanding dawned. "You weren't just looking for help. You were looking for someone to love him." Sarah nodded weakly. "I prayed for someone good to find us. Someone who would see him as more than an orphan boy." Her eyes found Deacon, who was sitting nearby with Levi sleeping in his arms. "I pray for people who knew what it meant to lose everything, but still chose to save what they could." That afternoon, as Sarah slipped peacefully away with Levi's hand in hers and Greta's prayers in her ears, she whispered her final request. "Promise me you'll keep him. Promise me you'll show him that God hears every prayer, even when the answer comes in ways we don't expect." Through her tears, Greta made the promise. Deacon, still holding the sleeping boy, nodded his agreement. "He'll know he's loved," Deacon said quietly. "He'll know he matters." They buried Sarah on a hill overlooking the ranch, with wildflowers from Greta's garden marking the grave. As they stood there with Levi between them, all three holding hands, Deacon finally understood what had brought them all together. "She was right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "God did hear her prayer. He brought her to people who knew what it meant to be saved by strangers." But even as they began to plan their new life as an unexpected family, storm clouds of a different kind were gathering. In town, Tobias Crane had heard about the boy at Deacon's ranch, and his greedy mind was already calculating ways to profit from another's misfortune. Legal papers were being drawn up, and cruelty was sharpening its claws for one final assault on their fragile happiness. 3 weeks after Sarah Mitchell's funeral, Tobias Crane rode up to the ranch with legal papers fluttering in his hand like death certificates. His smile was sharp as a butcher's knife, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who saw profit in other people's pain. Behind him rode Sheriff Coleman, looking uncomfortable with his mission but bound by law to carry it out. "Hayes," Tobias called out, not bothering to dismount. "I understand you're harboring a minor child without proper legal authority. That's a serious matter in the territory." Deacon stepped out of the cabin, Greta beside him, their hands instinctively finding each other. Levi peered out from behind Greta's skirt, sensing the threat these men represented even if he didn't understand the words. "The boy's mother entrusted him to our care before she died," Deacon said evenly, though his jaw was tight with controlled anger. "We witnessed her final wishes." Tobias laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Witnessed by 2 unmarried people living in sin? That won't hold up in any court." He waved the papers. "I've done my research, Hayes. Sarah Mitchell had a brother in Oregon, but she also had a cousin right here in Harbor Peak. Me. That makes me the boy's closest legal relative, and I have every right to claim him." Greta's heart lurched. She'd heard the stories about Tobias, how he'd run his own younger brother off the family farm, how he squeezed every penny from the desperate folks who came to him for loans. "You don't want Levi," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You want whatever inheritance might come with him." "What I want," Tobias replied coldly, "is to do my Christian duty and raise that boy properly, not leave him with a barren woman and a man too broken to even go to church." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Deacon, I'm sorry, but the law's the law, unless you can prove legal guardianship." Or, he hesitated, looking between them. "Well, unless you were properly married, I got to take the boy into protective custody until the court decides." That evening, as Levi slept fitfully in the cabin, Deacon and Greta sat on the porch under a canopy of stars. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on them like the endless Montana sky. "There's only one way," Deacon said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "We get married. Tonight. Make it legal before Tobias can file his claim." Greta looked at him, searching his storm-gray eyes in the moonlight. "Is that what you want? A marriage of convenience to save Levi?" Deacon was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through her hair. 3 weeks ago, if someone told me I'd be sitting here planning a wedding, I'd have called them crazy. But then you came, and everything changed. The ranch came alive. I started praying again. I started believing maybe God hadn't given up on me after all. He stood and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Greta Winslow, I can't promise you'll never see my grief again. I can't promise I'll always know the right words or do the right things. But I can promise you this. You prayed for someone to see you as more than your failures, and I do. You're the strongest, most faithful woman I've ever known. You made me remember what it feels like to hope." Tears spilled down Greta's cheeks. "And you," she whispered, "you heard God's voice calling you to help a stranger, and you listened. Even when your own heart was broken, you still had room in it for someone else's pain." He cupped her face gently. "You thought only God heard your cry that day in the dust. But he sent me to whisper back, you're not alone anymore." They were married that night by Marshall Thompson, with Nakoa and his wife as witnesses, and Levi sleeping peacefully in Greta's arms. It wasn't the wedding either had dreamed of as young people, but it was real and sacred and born from the kind of love that grows in the soil of shared suffering. 2 days later, the courthouse in Harbor Peak buzzed with tension as the custody hearing began. Judge Harrison, a fair man, but one who followed the letter of the law, listened as Tobias laid out his case with oily confidence. "Your Honor, I'm a successful businessman with a fine home in town. I can provide young Levi with education, social connections, and the benefits of civilization. These people live like hermits on a failing ranch, and their sudden marriage reeks of desperation and impropriety." But when it came time for Deacon and Greta to speak, something remarkable happened. The courtroom filled with unexpected witnesses. Nakoa spoke of how Greta had helped his wife through a difficult childbirth a week before. Dr. Henderson testified that Deacon had ridden 20 miles in a blizzard to help pull a neighbor's horse from a frozen creek. Even Celine Murphy stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "I've watched this town treat Mrs. Winslow. Mrs. Hayes, like she was cursed by God," Celine said, her eyes bright with tears. "But I've seen her faith shine through every cruel word, every turn back. If God was testing her, she passed that test long before she ever met Deacon Hayes." Then 5-year-old Levi took the stand, his small voice clear and true. "The bad man wants to take me away from Mama Greta and Papa Deacon. But my real mama told me before she went to heaven that God sent them to love me. She said I should trust the people who fight for me, not the ones who want to own me." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison looked at Tobias, whose face had gone red with frustrated rage, then at Deacon and Greta, who sat with their arms around Levi, their faith shining like a beacon in the midst of the storm. "In all my years on this bench," the judge said finally, "I've learned to recognize the hand of providence when I see it. This boy's mother traveled through a deadly storm to find these people. They saved his life, buried her with dignity, and opened their hearts to a child who wasn't their blood, but became their son through love." He banged his gavel once, the sound echoing through the hushed room. "Custody is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Deacon Hayes, with full legal adoption to follow." Tobias stormed out, his greed thwarted by grace, but the rest of Harbor Peak erupted in quiet celebration. As they walked out of the courthouse, Levi's hands in theirs, Greta whispered, "Thank you for hearing my cry in the dust, Lord." Deacon squeezed her hand. "And thank you for sending her to remind me that you make beauty from ashes." But even as they savored their victory, both knew the real work was just beginning. They had won the right to be a family. Now they had to build a life worthy of the miracle that had brought them together. The question wasn't whether God had answered their prayers, but whether they would prove faithful stewards of the gifts he had placed in their hands. 1 year later, autumn painted the Montana prairie in shades of gold and crimson as Harbor Peak prepared for its most unusual celebration. The entire town had gathered at the courthouse, not for another legal battle, but for Levi's formal adoption ceremony, a day that would make official what everyone could see had been written in the stars from the very beginning. Judge Harrison smiled as he looked down at the transformed family standing before his bench. Deacon Hayes looked like a man who'd found his way back from the wilderness, his eyes bright with purpose and peace. Greta wore a simple blue dress that made her shine like morning sunlight, her hand resting protectively on Levi's shoulder. And Levi himself, now 6 years old and thriving, stood tall with the confidence of a boy who knew exactly where he belonged. "It's not often," the judge said, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom, "that we get to celebrate the completion of a miracle. But that's what we have here today, a miracle that began with desperate prayers and ends with a family that no earthly law created, but that God himself orchestrated." As he signed the final papers, Levi tugged on Greta's skirt. "Mama, does this mean I'm really your boy forever now?" "Forever and always, sweetheart," Greta whispered, kneeling to hug him close. "God gave you to us, and nothing will ever change that." The celebration continued at the ranch, where neighbors who had once whispered cruel gossips now brought covered dishes and genuine smiles. Celine Murphy, transformed by witnessing grace in action, had organized the whole gathering. Even Dr. Henderson, who'd once questioned God's mercy toward Greta, now spoke openly about the miracle he'd witnessed. "I've been doctoring for 30 years, he told the assembled crowd, "and I've seen plenty of sick children. But I've never seen anything like what happened the night that boy's fever broke. Those two worked like they had heaven's own guidance, and maybe they did." As evening approached and the guests began heading home, Nakaw approached Deacon and Greta. The wise elder's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "My grandmother always said some storms bring exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. You three were each other's answer to prayers you didn't even know you were praying." Later, as twilight settled over the ranch, the family sat on their porch, the same porch where Greta had first arrived in desperation and fear. Now it was a place of peace, watching Levi chase fireflies while his parents planned their future together. "We need to expand the cabin," Deacon said, his arm around Greta's shoulders. "Make room for the people who are going to find their way to us." Greta looked at him curiously. "What people?" "The broken ones. The forgotten ones. The people like we used to be." Deacon's voice held quiet certainty. "God didn't save us just for ourselves, Greta. He saved us so we could save others." As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant sound of a wagon approaching through the darkness. Greta and Deacon exchanged glances. Who would be traveling this late, this far from town? The wagon rolled into view carrying a young woman not much older than Greta had been when she first arrived. Her clothes were worn, her face streaked with tears, and in her arms she held a baby that couldn't have been more than a few months old. Behind her, a boy of perhaps 8 sat with the resigned expression of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be cruel. The woman climbed down slowly, exhaustion evident in every movement. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," she called out, her voice breaking. "I'm Mary Patterson. I heard there was a family here who understood what it meant to have nowhere else to go." Greta was already moving toward her, Levi running alongside. "You're not bothering anyone, honey." "What happened?" "My husband died in a mining accident 3 months ago," Mary sobbed. "The company said it wasn't their fault, wouldn't pay anything. I lost our house, lost everything. I've been living in the wagon with my children, looking for work, but nobody wants to hire a woman with a baby." Deacon stepped forward, and his voice was gentle as morning rain. "Ma'am, I want you to know something. A year ago, my wife arrived at this ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and faith in a God who seemed to have forgotten her name. Today, she's the strongest woman in Montana, and this ranch is home to miracles. Mary looked between them, hope and disbelief warring in her tired eyes. Are you saying? I'm saying God has a funny way of bringing people together right when they need each other most, Greta said, taking the baby gently into her arms. We've got room in the cabin, and Deacon's right. This ranch needs more life in it. That night, as they settled their unexpected guests into the room that had once been Tommy's, the room where Greta herself had first found refuge, Levi whispered to his parents, "Is this how I came here too? Did God send me when you needed me?" "That's exactly how it happened, son," Deacon said, tucking him in a bed. "God heard Mama Greta crying in the dust, and he heard your Mama Sarah praying in the storm, and he brought us all together because that's what families do. We find each other when we need each other most." 6 months later, the Hayes Ranch had become something extraordinary. Mary had proven herself gifted with horses and now managed the breeding program. Her son Jake had appointed himself Levi's big brother and teacher. Little Emma, the baby, filled the house with laughter that echoed in ways that healed old wounds and created new joys. But more than that, word had spread throughout the territory about the ranch where broken families could find healing. A steady stream of widows, orphans, and lost souls found their way to Deacon and Greta's door, and somehow, miraculously, there was always room for one more. Standing on their porch one evening, watching their extended family work together to bring in the harvest, Greta turned to her husband with wonder in her eyes. "Do you remember that first night when you told me maybe God hadn't given up on you?" Deacon pulled her close, his heart full to overflowing. "I remember. I also remember thinking I was nobody's answer to prayer. And now," Deacon looked out over the thriving ranch, at the children playing in the yard, at the women hanging laundry while they sang hymns, at the men working together like brothers they'd chosen rather than been born to. "Now I know that God hears every desperate prayer, every cry in the dust, every plea whispered in the darkness. And sometimes he whispers back through the hearts of cowboys and the love of families chosen by heaven itself." As stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Greta whispered her own prayer of gratitude. "Thank you for hearing my cry, Lord. Thank you for sending me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it." And in the gentle evening breeze, in the laughter of children, in the contented sounds of a ranch full of life and love, heaven whispered back, "Well done, faithful servants. Well done."